Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Okay, as they said, my name is Rachel. I'm one of the directors of ATOL HR, and this morning we will be talking about disciplinary, grievance and absence, all the meaty and the difficult stuff when it comes to managing your employees. Like Hannah said, if you've got questions, if I can answer them straight away, I'll try to. If not, I will definitely cover them at the end. If there is anything more personal, more confidential, there will be a way for you to be able to message me and I'll be able to answer it that way. So let's make a start, please. Thank you. Okay, so this morning we will be covering disciplinary versus capability. Capability is another word for performance. So the difference between managing someone through disciplinary and managing through poor performance. Oh, sorry, can we go back? Sorry. Thank you. We'll cover grievances, sickness, absence, health and disability, the appeals process, and what you need to do with respect, to keeping notes and records. Thank you. So let's move on. Thank you. Okay, so just for my benefit, how many of you ever conducted disciplinary? And that means either leading one or being the support manager, or not at all? Okay, so a real mixture there. Obviously, over half of you have not conducted or been involved in a disciplinary. So this will be a really good session for you just to understand some of the basics of what you really need to do. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so what is a disciplinary procedure? Most people think that it's very simple, very basic. I will say there is a lot of legislation that leads into disciplinary that you must comply with if you are an employer. This is the one area that if you get it wrong, it can cost you a lot of money, okay, with regards to employment tribunals. The one thing to think about with legislation and employment law, it differs greatly from criminal law. So most people think they are similar. In criminal law, as you all know, you have to prove something beyond reasonable doubt. However, with employment law, you do not have to prove something. It is down to your genuine belief. So that is a massive difference between what you're used to and what you know. So let's start. If you do not have a disciplinary procedure, obviously you must follow ACAS's basic guidelines. If you've got a process, I would say you need to follow it. With a disciplinary procedure, why do we need one? It's about managing standards and behaviour, or poor behaviour. Okay, it's where you need to set the guidelines of what you expect from your employees. If you do need to conduct a disciplinary procedure, one of the key areas that falls under legislation will be, was it done in a timely manner? So if you do not action anything for a month, then technically you could be seen as actually not actioning it, and you could fail straight away. Even if someone has done some form of misconduct, if you've delayed it without any reason or genuine reason, you will have failed as an employer. You must allow, in these circumstances, your employee to have a companion. Okay, and I'll talk a bit more about companions later, but they are allowed to have a support person with them. They are also allowed to have a right of appeal of the outcome. And I would say, please take notes, and I will come back to taking notes and why they're important later. So the basics are, you must follow a process. If you don't have a process, follow ACAS. You must do it in a timely manner, allow a companion and a right of appeal, and take notes. Okay, next slide, please. So there you go. Please, if you don't have a policy and you wanted to discipline an employee tomorrow, what would you do? Okay. Contact ACAS. ACAS will help you. However, sometimes they will just reaffirm what you know, and they don't always tell you exactly what to do. ACAS are great as a helpline. If you wanted to get it exactly right, a lawyer is the way to do it, in a very expensive way. Our old friend Mr. Google, yes, everyone uses Google, but just be careful, and please don't do the last one. Use your own knowledge if you don't know. I would say ACAS is the first step, and if it's a really, really complex situation and you do not have any HR or any HR support, you would need to go to a lawyer. Next slide, please. So let's just say an incident has happened, okay, and do you need to investigate every single situation? I would say most of the time, some form of investigation needs to happen because there are two sides to every story. So are they necessary? Yes, I think they are. Who should conduct them? I understand some of your organizations may be small. If possible, the person who conducts the investigation should not be the same person who's going to do the disciplinary. So it doesn't matter if they are the same level, it doesn't have to be someone more senior. We would always encourage, where possible, someone completely different than who's going to do the disciplinary. So think longer term when you decide who this will be. And where do you start? So I would be starting with, you must always ask the person you plan to discipline to write a statement of the event. So let's say, for example, you thought there a theft had occurred. You would ask them, you know, their opinions if they've done anything. You'd look at CCTV. You can look at if it's something to do any other form of media. So maybe that's something on the computer. It really, all you're doing is gathering the facts. Your role as the investigator is not to determine the outcome. Your role is to actually say whether there is enough evidence to warrant a disciplinary, and that is your only role. So if I had to investigate, I would build a portfolio, and the outcome would be, yes, I would recommend a disciplinary, or no, there's not enough evidence. And that is all your role is. And then you would pass it over to the disciplinary chair. Okay, so next, suspension. Please be aware that if you are going to suspend your employees, it should really be in your disciplinary policy somewhere. If you do suspend someone, you have to suspend them on full pay. Okay, because suspension is not an act of you assuming they are guilty. The reasons why you would need to suspend someone is to protect the case. So, for example, if it was a fraud case, and obviously you were concerned about the business, if there had been a fight between two people, you may need to keep them separate. If there'd been a bullying accusation, you may need to keep them separate. Or if by the person being in the workplace while the investigation is going on could influence the outcome, you may need to suspend them for that reason. It's not automatic. You don't need to suspend for every case. You need to just suspend in those situations I've explained. But please remember, it's on full pay. And really, ideally, it should be as short as possible. It's rare you should need to suspend someone for more than a week or two, because you should have completed your investigation that time. It does happen in some cases, but it needs to be kept as short as possible. Okay, so next slide, please. Obviously, with any disciplinary, there is a range of sanctions that could come out of it. I'm sure you've all seen these. If it's an informal warning, you would not have had to go through the full disciplinary procedure with the companion and writing the letters and the invites. And informal is exactly what it says. A verbal warning is still classed as formal. It still goes on their personnel records. It's just a lower sanction you can have. First written warning normally would be on someone's records for around 6 months. After that, it is seen as spent. Final written, people have between 12 and 18 months on someone's records. And obviously dismissal, there are two forms. There is immediate with gross misconduct, or there could be dismissal with notice. And there is always the alternatives to dismissal. So you may give someone a final written warning and then choose to demote them, or take away a bonus, or take away some overtime, or transfer them to a different department. Doesn't always happen, but it is there as an option if you really wanted to keep that employee, but you felt that you needed to do more than just give them a final written warning. Okay, next slide, please. Obviously, I've been involved in a number of disciplinaries over the years. These are some of the common mistakes which, if you do, could result in you losing a case, a tribunal case, even if misconduct has happened. So when you think there is a situation and you invite someone to a disciplinary, if you do not warn them that it is a disciplinary hearing and potential outcomes are, and I tend to list most of that list on the previous slide, particularly if you are considering dismissing them, if you do not give them the advance warning, that could be seen as a failure in the process. You also need to inform the employee, to be fair, of what you're accusing or the allegations you're accusing them of. You couldn't just say, we invite you to a disciplinary and no reasons. That would not be deemed reasonable or fair. If it was you and you've been invited to disciplinary, you didn't know why, I wouldn't be happy with that. And that is something that you must explain in detail. It doesn't have to be pages, but it could be you've been invited to a disciplinary because your recent behaviour of your poor driving did not meet the health and safety standards. It can be as simple as that. If you have any evidence you are considering, so whether that is statements from other employees, whether that is CCTV, the employee in question is entitled to see all of that evidence beforehand. Now, the difficulty you have is if statements have been written by their colleagues about them, I would say where possible, you need to try to make them anonymous. So employee A, and you take their names off, because obviously if you don't dismiss and they come back to the workplace, it can have a knock-on effect of relationships and the team. Allowing a companion. I am assuming you know who the companions are, but if with a companion, it can only be a work colleague. If you're under the age of 18, it can be a parent or a trade union representative. Now, some of you may not have trade unions. The employee could ask for a qualified trade union representative to come into your business and represent them. If that is the case, I would recommend that you ask to see the qualifications of that trade union representative, because I have seen people try to bring in a friend of a friend of a friend who's a trade union and they're not really qualified to do it. And obviously they are coming into your business and they are hearing potentially confidential information. You cannot bring in a friend, a relative, a lawyer, any of those things at all. And the role of a companion is the role of a companion. They are not a solicitor. They are not a lawyer. They can't answer questions for your employee. They're there as support. So just be conscious that if they start to be detrimental to the process or take over, you can warn them and you could remove them and ask for a replacement. Common mistakes, obviously not conducting a thorough investigation. Sometimes some of these things are complex and they're often, you wouldn't believe the can of worms when you open it of what comes out when you do conduct an investigation. The right to appeal, you can appeal whatever the sanction is, even if it's a written warning, you have to, when you give them the letter to say your sanction was a first written warning, you have the right to appeal and you must appeal to, and you must give them that right. Not keeping records, for all the will in the world, no one's got the best memory. You can't remember everything. You must keep notes and records, not only from a GDPR point of view, but from an employment tribunal point of view. Having the same person dealing with the whole process. This may be a challenge for some of you if you've got small organizations. If at all possible, like I said, you need to have someone different from the investigation to the disciplinary. But it wouldn't be seen as unreasonable if it had to be the same person down to the size of the company. And obviously try not to delay the process. If it was a holiday and people were absent, that's fine. But just because you're busy and you haven't got time to deal with it would not be seen as justification for a delay. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so this is a case study for you because I'm conscious that obviously me doing all the talking, you've all got cases and things that you want to think about. So if you could have a read of that, please. Okay, if we could bring up the slider. Okay. You are correct in the bottom two should never happen. You'd be amazed how many people would ignore a problem until it causes absolute pain, and then they want it resolved immediately. Obviously not the bottom one, and it does happen. People do say that. If it was me, technically, depending on how much he's done, if he is being rude and there are customer complaints, and if he is being late, you could arrange a disciplinary. You'd be entitled to do that. Obviously, you definitely could do the top one, have an informal meeting and address your concerns. But at that point, that is when you'd need to say to him, you cannot tolerate his behavior any longer. And if he continues to be late and there are complaints, or he is continuing to be rude, you would be disciplining him. So me personally, I'd probably arrange a disciplinary, but if you're more comfortable, I think you really have to put a stamp in the ground here and say, this is how we're going to manage you. He can't dictate your business. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so with capability, like I said, we mean poor performance. There is a big difference between disciplinary and capability. So most people think, oh, if someone's not performing, I discipline them. It doesn't work that way. Okay, so with a disciplinary, that is often about someone's chosen behavior and chosen misconduct. Whether it's intentional or not, it's a behavior or an action that they've done. With capability, this is more around someone's performance. Now, it may be because they're in the wrong job, they've been promoted too quickly, they're just not good enough for the role, or square peg, round hole. You need to manage these processes differently. With capability, you need to be seen to give the person the opportunity and set them some targets and do it that way, work through it, depending on where they are with their service. If they're in probation, it's different. But once they've reached probation and gone past that, then you would be setting targets, give them a chance to improve. You need to be seen to support those individuals. You can still manage someone out through capability. With disciplinary, it's investigation, hearing, outcome, and sanction. They are very, very different processes. Okay, next slide, please. Very, very common situation, this one. Slido, please.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, was that too quick?
Yeah.
Sorry. Sorry.
These things that you've been sharing, there's like an opportunity. Okay. And then you can put them together.
Okay, can we move to the Slido, please? Thank you. Perfect. I've seen all of these happen, but you definitely, unfortunately, cannot do very much while he's off sick. However frustrating that is, and it does happen, you can't invite them to a disciplinary while they are off sick, or you can't manage their performance while they're off sick. You do need to wait for them to return. Obviously, if it went on for months and months, the situation would be different. Please don't just ignore it, because that is sometimes why people get signed off sick. They bury their head and think that the situation will go away. And obviously, by saying that his sickness is not genuine, you've not really got evidence of that, even if you think it. Just out of interest, if anyone want to put anything in the chat bar about experiencing a situation like this, where they've had someone go off and signed off sick in a situation, and they're a bit like, what do I do? Right, nothing's come up, so I will move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so a grievance. What is a grievance? It is a complaints procedure. It's the way your employee can raise an official, formal complaint or issue with you. If someone comes in whinging in your office and says it's not fair, this has happened, the first thing I will be saying as the employer is, please complete a grievance statement. If you have a grievance form, that's fine. If not, a written statement. You should really have a grievance procedure. If you don't have one, then obviously there's the ACAS standards again. But they need to put it in writing. This is an example of what we've had this week. We've with one of our clients where we've had someone resign, and then in their letter they said, I'm going to complain about constructive dismissal because of all the grievances I've put in and you've not done anything about them. We've never had a single grievance entered from that individual. His view of a grievance is, well, he's moaned that he doesn't think he's paid enough, or he's moaned that his role is not as good as someone else's. That's not an official grievance. You do need to have it in writing. It doesn't really matter what it looks like, but you need to have someone saying, I want to log a grievance. Now, your role then as a manager is to obviously, if you have a policy, follow it, but to sit down with the individual. And the first question you would need to ask them is, what is your grievance? Can you explain it to me? Now, there's a couple of obviously options of what comes out of it. You could uphold their grievance and fix the problem, whatever it may be. You may completely throw it out and say, sorry, there's absolutely, this is not founded, or you can partially uphold it. It purely depends on the situation. So the kind of things people could put grievance in for could be around bullying and harassment. It could be around they don't think they're being paid enough. It could be around some of the processes or not getting training. It could be a number of things. Grievances are often put in when someone's in the middle of a disciplinary as well, and I will come back to that one later on. So don't panic when a grievance comes in. Look at it in the facts. Don't just see it as someone whinging. There could be facts and truth to it. It could be someone who has a real genuine reason, not just throwing it in for the sake of it. Please take grievances seriously and never discipline someone for raising a grievance. Okay, next slide, please. With a protected characteristic, apologies if you know this, but that could mean discrimination based on someone's age, a disability, gender reassignment, marriage or civil partnership, pregnancy or maternity, race, religion or belief, their sex or their sexual orientation. Okay, so this person individual has basically put in a grievance saying that you are only taking me down the performance route because of a protected characteristic. So what would you do? Next slide, please. Okay, it's definitely the top one. Okay, obviously, if your organization is not you to be able to delegate the grievance, then you would have to hold them separately. Please don't delay a disciplinary or a capability, whatever it may be, because the grievance is held. They are two separate processes and can run in parallel. In the ideal world, it would be with two different managers leading them. If that's not feasible because of the size of your organization, then they must be dealt with separately, two separate meetings. But you do not need to delay something because a grievance is put in. You can continue with both processes. Obviously, the bottom two definitely don't do, or you could end up in a tribunal for that. Okay, next slide, please. So we've talked about disciplinaries and misconduct. We've talked about grievances, and we've also talked about capability. The other thing that causes pain for a lot of employers is absence. Some of these are quite obvious of why we need to manage it, because of the cost and time to your business. And if you're going to do it properly, you would support the employees, but they're also to manage absence is providing guidelines of your expectations of your employees. You know, you don't want unauthorized, you don't want high absence. And if there are potential problems bubbling or where support is needed, it's starting to have the open conversations with your employees. Slide A, please. Please be really, really honest with this question. Okay, when we ask most of our clients if they do this, they usually say, yes, we monitor it, and yes, we manage it. When you start to dig under the surface and we say, so, okay, do you know how many days you've actually lost to sickness absence? Do you know the reasons for it? Do you know what, you know, who's your highest employee for absence? And what do you actually do about it? That's when the walls start to crumble slightly. I think, if I'm being honest, lots of people do not manage it. They may have vague recollections of what people are absent, but do they really, really monitor it? And do they, by manage it, actually give people warnings and actually dismiss for absence? I'm not sure enough employers actually do this or are confident to be able to do this. So if we could move on, please. Some of these are quite obvious. So by your short-term infrequent, they're your ideal employees. So someone that is absent, but very rarely, you know, a few days, and it doesn't often happen. Frequent, those are the ones that, you know, are often ill on 2, 3 times, 4 times, even 5 times every year, 2, 3 days each time, sometimes up to a week each time, ones that do cause you pain. Your long term, that could be, that's what I would class anything more than 2 weeks, or when you need GP notes to cover. Obviously, it could be for months and months if you depend on what the people's illness is. Patterns, people don't often recognize patterns, but if you start to look, you could see some employees who frequently take Mondays off, or Fridays, or linked to school holidays, linked to bank holidays, or top and telling with their own annual holidays. These are all patterns and are much, much more serious than the 3 above. Unauthorized absence is someone that is not followed your absence procedures, so just not turned up for work. Maybe that's just for a day, a couple of days. I have to be honest, I dealt with 3 cases this year and dismissed 3 employees this year for unauthorized absence. You think it doesn't happen very often. I've known people just go off the radar and never come back. You have to dismiss in their absence, or we've had ones that said, yes, I was in hospital for the last week or so, and when you ask for GP notes and doctor's notes, they can't provide them, or ones that have said they're sick and they've gone on holiday. You have all these sorts of things. Absence, it's not genuine. The ones that say they're ill, and they're actually not, they just want an extra day's holiday or just want to come in. The bottom three are technically fraud, okay, and should be treated far more seriously than the top three. If you're going to, usually, obviously, if you've got someone who's off a lot, you could end up dismissing, but the bottom three are people that are actually taking advantage of you as their employer. Okay, next slide, please. So, sickness absence. With this, there's very little legislation around how you manage this and what you need to do, unlike disciplinary and grievance. So I always say, have a policy, but please don't make your policy too rigid. If your policy states, if an employee has more than 6 days sick per year, we will discipline them, then you need to do it, and you need to do it for everyone. Sometimes less is more in these sort of policies. You need to be able to apply discretion. There is a big difference for me for an employee who has 2 days off with a sore throat, 3 days off with an upset stomach, 2 days with a bad back. Straight away, you're talking 7-8 days. Then someone who maybe had an accident or a problem at home with mental health or anything like that. Each situation in every case is different. If your policy is too rigid, it doesn't allow you to be flexible and apply discretion with each case. Likewise, when it comes to paying enhanced pay, more often, the more sick pay you pay, the higher sickness absence you will have in your organisation. It's difficult for me. Some of our clients will say, should I pay it? I think there are better ways to support your employees, because technically you are then rewarding those that aren't in the business by paying a lot of enhanced sick pay. And you will get people taking advantage. If they think they've got, for example, the policy allows 2 weeks sick pay, some of them will take 2 weeks off sick. Reasonable adjustments I will come back to, but please remember with all of these, you will be looked at to make sure you are treating people fairly. If you have an employee who is pregnant and off sick with any form of pregnancy related illness, you cannot discipline that person without risking a huge claim against you. They are completely protected if they're pregnant and go off with any maternity related illness. So please do not discipline pregnant employees in that respect. Any other legislation it's quite flexible with how you do this. There is not a process on ACAS for managing sickness absence. So what I may deem as high absence could be different from you guys, and I may manage it differently, but I would say you need to be fair, apply discretion, and be reasonable and consistent. So you couldn't discipline an employee who'd had 4 days and someone who'd had 44 for similar reasons, because that would be deemed unreasonable. So I'm just going to look at this question. I recommend supposed to be empathetic to. So I can't get the whole question up. Hang on, here again. Hang on, sorry. It's very hard to manage when we are meant to tell people they need to try not to take this forwards of patterns too. Yes, I can obviously appreciate that, and it is very difficult when someone cites depression or anxiety, because some of those illnesses are protected characteristics under disability, and it does frighten managers to be able to manage anything around the mental health. Please don't be too scared with that, because it can be protected, and I'll come back to what disability means, but it doesn't mean people can take as much time as they want. Yes, you can be supportive, but there are other illnesses that need support as well. And anything with patterns should really be looked at, because if you are genuinely suffering from mental health, there would be patrons wouldn't be rigid unless there was a situation that was driving it. But obviously, you'd need to really look in depth at each case. Next slide, please. So when we talk about disability and someone classed as having a disability, obviously some of it is very obvious, particularly when it comes to things like the wheelchairs and that side of disability, but there's much, much more to it. Legislation, this is where it helps. For someone to be classed as having a disability, they need to have an illness which has affected them long term, and that usually means for more than 12 months, and something that has a huge impact on their day-to-day life. So someone that says, I've been signed off for 1 week for anxiety, out of the blue like that, would not be classed as disabled. Someone who has had long-term mental health and is supported through their doctor and has been for more than 12 months and has had periods of depression, that could be classed as disabled. So technically, the reasons are the same, but they're different cases and different impacts on their home life. Some of these are very obvious, obviously MS and Parkinson's, schizophrenia, bipolar, all of these, that is not an exhaustive list. Likewise with cancer, there was so much on there where a person can be classed as disabled. Please don't be scared, but also I'm not a GP. There are people out there that can give you support when you've got employees sharing situations like this. Also, you have a right to contact employees' GPs for you to understand more and give them the right support. We have had, I did have an individual who claimed that she had illness and therefore was classed as disabled. And when we asked to write to her GP to understand more, her response was, my GP doesn't know anything about it. So just be conscious, you do have people that do try to take advantage and do try to scare you, but likewise there are some really genuine cases where if you can provide support, you could get so much more out of your employees and really benefit and help them. So if you do have these cases, then there is mitigation when how you do manage their absence levels. Sorry, there's a question that's come in. I would say I would need to understand, I'm not a GP, I'm not going to pretend I am. I would need to understand more from someone's GP with that. And I would need to, if it was me as the employer, I would be writing to the GP to understand, and you can give them a list of questions about, you know, how does it affect their work, what should we expect, and depends on what the GP comes back with would be classed if it's disability, how long it's been going on. So yes, it's not a great answer, but yes, it could be, but I would want to understand more about that situation before I determine if someone would be classed as having a disability. If this is affecting their performance, could you talk over the employer and also ask? Yes, you could. So obviously I don't know what the reasons are, but if there is something that someone is performing badly, then please do start the conversations with the employee. There could be things going on that you don't know about, and you may be able to put some sort of reasonable adjustment in place. Likewise, it may not be, but yes, you can write to GPs, you can write to consultants. Usually, you would have that information that you are allowed to write to a GP in a policy or in contracts of employment. Doesn't mean you can't do it, but by putting that caveat in a policy, it then gives you automatic rights to be able to contact someone's GP. But just to say out of the blue, they would still need to give their approval. I would be very concerned if an employee refused to allow you to contact their GP. Because why, when you are trying to help them? If that is the case, then you have to make decisions and actions based on the information you know, which if that's nothing, then technically, and you did end up dismissing or taking someone for a disciplinary, you would be more protected because you did try to find out from a GP more information and they withheld that information. So you based your decision on the facts that you knew. If you don't contact the GP at all and you base it just on your own opinion, that's when it will go more against you. So more often than not, try to get as much information as possible, because that will go in your favour should a worse situation occur. Okay, next slide, please. So over to you guys. Okay, if I had to put the vote in, my vote would be 4 to 6 days. The average absence levels in 2021 for government statistics was 4.4 days. Obviously depends on the industry, obviously depends on whether you get sick pay, but yes, it depends on what you do. So I think one of the highest areas where for sickness is in the teaching industry. Not quite sure if that's because they have 12 months for sick pay, not that I'm cynical, but they do. If you don't get paid, often people aren't ill. That's not always the right answer, but 4 to 6 is where I would be. More than 12 is extremely generous, to be honest, and it's rare that someone would have that much time off. Obviously, this goes to show how people view absence levels is very different, and it's why sometimes you don't want to be too rigid in a policy, because everyone views absence, you know, at the moment we've got from less than 3 days to 12, which people find okay. So it just goes to show, and this is where you need to be consistent. If you had a larger organization, and for example, if you had 2 managers in there, one who would want to manage someone who'd been off a few days and one who was happy for someone to take up to 12, that's where you'd get the inconsistencies. So we have a case of an employee having sickness absence due to mental health reasons, anxiety. So I'm just reading this very quickly. The anxiety is linked to a grievance that they raised in point station. How do we manage when the 2 processes are linked? Any anxiety is linked to the outcomes of the grievance, which is okay, this is a tricky one. Obviously, they've raised a grievance, you do have to do it. I understand any of these processes I've talked about today will raise someone's anxiety levels. To me, that's more a situational anxiety, albeit I'm not a GP. I would continue with the grievance, but if someone's absence does continue, then technically you do have to manage them. It can't go on forever. You can't manage them while they're off, but when they come back, you can give them warnings about it. The best, it sounds daft, but sometimes when someone goes off, they're actually prolonging the situation themselves. So she's raised a grievance, you need to get the grievance resolved, and then hopefully, depending on the outcome, the anxiety may reduce. It's a very tricky one, that, and a very common one, but I would push through with the grievance and then deal with the absence levels and after, if possible, and if she's back to the workplace. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've talked about reasonable adjustments. So it doesn't just mean hard objects like you see a chair for someone with a bad back. Reasonable adjustments can be something that you can't physically see. So someone mentioned about sleep deprivation. If that was classed as a disability, then you may have to slightly alter someone's working hours to start later and finish later. It could be that you have to be more flexible with, you know, if it was ME or MS, then you may have to be more flexible about their working arrangements. Do they need to work from home for some reason and then in the office? Obviously, you've got disobeys. And then you may need to even change someone's role and responsibilities, where they're sat in the office, where they're placed. There are lots of ways to make reasonable adjustments. Obviously, employees may ask for them, and you do not have to give them everything. If it's the huge cost and you can't, then that is an absolutely reasonable excuse for you not to authorize something. If it just cannot be managed in the organization, you could refuse it that way. Reasonable is exactly what it means. You can't be held to ransom to make every adjustment that an employee requests. It could be a GP requests it, it could be from the employee, or it could be just from a conversation that, you know, what will really help you get back to work, or what will really help you perform better. The more open conversations you have, the better with this. Okay, next slide, please. When someone's been off, I don't know how many of you do this, then return to work interviews. If someone's been off for one day, you may not have the time or the inclination to do it. If you start to see high absence, or people are off for longer, particularly if they're off for a week or more, I would be encouraging you all to do a return to work interview. Now, you can come up with your own template or form. These can be found on Google if you want to search for them, but it's a way of actually recording why someone was off, how long they were off, the reasons they were off for, if they've seen any medical practitioner, and it's just for your records. You never know when you might need to come back to this information. And it's sometimes, by doing this, it makes people think about whether they do want to take time off when they could like make the effort and try to be in work. These return to work interviews are a very important process of managing sickness absence. Okay, next slide, please. Let's start with the top one. So there's a lot of work there. So obviously you've got a guy who's had a few days off sick, and the last one was when it was on Friday. He said he had a cold, but obviously social media being what it is, there were pictures of him out clubbing, completely under the influence at 4 a.m. You've obviously been shown this, been told this. What action would you take on the Monday when he does come back, when you've been given this information? If anyone wants to put anything in the chat bar, if they've ever experienced this. Okay, so someone's put a disciplinary. You could, if it was me, I mean, because you've got evidence there, but he could say, well, I still had a cold. I would probably meet with him on the Monday and let him know that I was aware that actually he was out clubbing until 4 a.m. and, you know, ask him if he genuinely did have a cold or whether it was because he had a hangover. Just say, I am now conscious of what you're doing. If I believe there are any repeated situations similar to this, then I could be looking at disciplining you. Is probably what I would do as a start to see if it if the situation occurs. If it occurs again and you do have more evidence, then I would be potentially looking at a disciplinary to see under the aspect of not genuine absence. But I would start by just letting his collar be felt to say that you are aware. It's where unfortunately social media does help you as an employer. Okay, situation number 2. This is a real life situation as well, and one that we have experienced. Does it matter? I suppose. Would anyone be concerned, or would people just not worry about it because it's a week? It's a week in, you know, in October. Does it really matter in the grand scheme of things? Would be my first question. And would anyone really be bothered to do anything? Okay.
Quite a few people are popping in the chat about the fact it's
Yeah.
school holidays that time.
Okay, so I'm going to be honest, it was school holidays. And for 3 years on the trot, she'd run out of holiday and took the October half term off. Oops, sorry, I've lost the can we go back forward? I think I've lost that. There you go. Yes, it was the October half term. She'd run out of holiday and it never really got flagged because her absence was always really good all year. So it technically only worked out 5 days absence. But it wasn't until there was a pattern. It was every October half term for 3 years on the banks. So they did sit down with the individual and did explain it to her and told her that they believed there was a pattern and they believed that it wasn't genuine absence and it didn't happen again in that case. And it was just a way of dealing with it. But yes, this is ones where are really quite serious because it, you know, and probably quite common, and it's ones that often fall under the radar. What I say to my clients is if you're ever concerned that there may be a problem with someone's absence, I say to them, get the whole calendar year and then mark off, a bit like I call it a bingo chart. So like you're dabbing your numbers, all the days they were off, you will be able to see visually immediately if there is a pattern with someone's absence. Okay, so the last one. This is one that I actually dealt with myself. I have actually experienced this one. What would anyone do? So someone would go to the pub. I did go to the pub, yes. So I went to the pub and just pretended to be a normal, gone out for a normal drink, and there was a bar manager there, and I asked to speak to this individual. I said that I knew him and I just wanted to say hello, and they said, oh sorry, he's not on shift today, he left last week. And I said, oh right, how long has he been here? I thought he'd been here a while. And I got all the information from him, and just to back up the claims that we of the people that had shared some information. And let's just say he doesn't work for the company anymore. But that was a genuine case of someone that was getting paid full sick pay and then getting paid full-time working in a pub. Okay, next slide, please. I've mentioned a number of times appeals. So yes, you must obviously allow your employees the opportunity to appeal a process. It must say in the letter whether it's a grievance, whether it's capability, whether it's an absence sanction, whether it's disciplinary. Every employee has the right to appeal. Yes, it causes you more pain. Yes, you may have to do another hearing, but it's a legal right. By removing that legal right, you would lose a case in a tribunal. What does it mean when they appeal? Quite often it could be because they don't like the outcome you've given them, particularly if it's a disciplinary sanction. How do you do an appeal? You would sit down with, is there a timescale for an appeal? Depends on your policy. I always say you have 5 working days to appeal. And I would put that in the letter because otherwise it just drags the situation out. But an appeal, the question I would ask someone sat down in an appeal is, can you give me your reasons for your appeal? Some people just say, I'm appealing, and they haven't really got any reason for it. And you need to let them do the talking. An appeal process does not mean a whole rehearing. it's usually a much shorter one, and then obviously there's usually two outcomes. You either uphold it and you may change the outcome, or you agree with the original sanction. Where possible, the person hearing the appeal should be different than the person doing the disciplinary, but again, I understand it depends on the size of your organisation. Where possible, it should be two different people, but I appreciate it can't be. Obviously, like I said, ask them to appeal within 5 working days. Then I would be saying to you to try to hear the appeal within the next week or two. You shouldn't be dragging this process out too long. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so keeping notes. There are a number of reasons why you need to keep notes. One, because no one's memory is the best in the world. Okay, you also need to keep them for a data protection point of view. So I would be saying to keep notes and records like anything around personnel files for 6 years, just in case. That's the advice from GDPR. The benefits are, when situations occur, when people say things, I don't know how many employees you have, but you tend to keep notes on employees. It doesn't matter what it looks like. It doesn't matter what piece of paper it's written on, whether it's on a computer, but one, obviously remember confidentiality and where you keep it. Also, just remember what you do right. So if you're recruiting, for example, and you don't really like the person, please don't write anything derogatory on the form that they can't see, just in case they ever raise a claim about an unfair recruitment process and those notes have to go to a tribunal. It can always come back and bite you. So, if someone isn't explaining things clearly or someone that was aggressive, you can write those things, but not personal comments. Does that apply to keeping records on leavers? Would you keep leavers notes on file for that? Yeah, I would say keep all personnel files for 6 years, just in case. That's what data protection GDPR recommend. So obviously, because someone, even with a tribunal claim, they can take up to 3 months to put a claim in after they've left as well. And then obviously it depends on how long it takes to go through the process. There is a delay with tribunals, like anything post-COVID. You do need to keep records. So although it seems silly, if situations do occur, please keep notes. Because you will get he said, she said. If there are situations, you need to write things down as they happen if you think it's a serious situation, because you can't always remember the facts and details 3 months, 6 months time. Also remember, there is a legal process called it's a SAR, which is subject access request. Every employee has the right to put a subject access request in, which means you have to provide all data that's held about them with their name in it. And that doesn't just mean their personnel file. So sometimes when disciplinaries or tribunals are happening, you may have to respond, and it could be down to the emails, everything that's got their name in. So if you do have a very contentious case building up, just be careful what you are sending by emails, because you still would have to provide that as evidence. Sometimes what we've advised clients to do is just remove the person's name, because obviously we're talking externally and we're talking by email. Remove the person's name when you're corresponding, then that evidence doesn't have to go into a subject access request. You cannot ignore a subject access request if it comes in. It's a legal process through the ICO, and you usually have a month to respond to it, and it's a lot of work. So just be conscious of what you do write about people. WhatsApps can be used as well, text. So just however much someone might be a pain, just be conscious what you do write if it's got their name in it. And with WhatsApps have been used in tribunals before, messages when they've had group ones and there's been cases of bullying, etc. Even if it's personal group WhatsApps, those have been used in tribunals before. They got a great payoff when they raise a WhatsApp as a reference. It is amazing what people can use and what can come through in a subject access request. So notes are crucial, but obviously the right kind of notes. Okay, next slide, please. What my advice would be to you as employers and as directors and as managers is you have the right to manage your people. Okay. If I'm being honest, the pendulum has swung in legislation towards a bit of the power of the employee, and it feels like it's really, really difficult to manage situations, and it feels like employees can threaten tribunals or say, give me £5,000 and I'll go away quietly. It's quite scary when people start to put in, I'm going to speak to my lawyer or my solicitor about a tribunal or constructive dismissal. Please don't be scared of that. You have a right to manage your people. Be confident with that. Obviously, get advice where you can if you need to. Be fair and be consistent. And the challenge for you guys is to be factual, not emotional. And I understand that's really, really difficult. You are working with these people every day. You want everyone to have your beliefs and your culture and be as passionate as you are. But people are people, and they're not all the same as you, and they won't all have the same ethics and morals as you, which is disappointing sometimes. But when you make decisions, try to remove the emotion. It's easy for us to do that because we come in and we don't know you and we can look at the facts and base it on facts. But I understand when you're working with these people, it's very, very different. But try to be less emotive, and that will help you get to the right decision. I was also asked to say, to remind some of you guys that outside of this process, there's also things like holidays. And managing people's holidays doesn't fall under this agenda, but just a quick note on that you also need to ensure your employees take their holidays, because under the working time directive, they must allow it, but you also need to manage it. So how do you manage it when you have multiple requests? If everyone's leaving it to the last minute, then suddenly everyone wants the week building up to Christmas off and you've got no people in, you need to understand how you're going to manage it. You'll get peaks and troughs, particularly when you get World Cups or sporting events or bank holidays. So you need to go, are you going to go first come, first serve? You also need to really have a process that they need to give you notice, but also you can refuse holiday if you've got too many people off and it needs to fit in with the business. So don't be afraid, but obviously just ensure that people are taking the holiday when they should do. All these things as managers, you have the right, it's your business. And as long as you're seen as fair and consistent, then hopefully you won't go far wrong.